Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 287, The Shmita Project. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we begin a series of episodes that we're actually going to continue all year, not all in a row. We're going to do a number of episodes in a row right now, and then we're going to return to the subject over and over again as this year goes on. And that's because the subject is, and this year is, the Shmita year. Now, on the Jewish calendar, the Shmita comes every 7 years. Shmita is often translated as the sabbatical year. Technically, it means release. And in the Torah, there are two major things that happen during the Shmita year. One is that farmers are not allowed to actively plant and harvest crops. And the other is that debts are to be forgiven. Now, there are a lot of related subtopics that we're going to look at over the course of this series and over the course of the whole year. Whether it was actually ever really observed, what the rabbis made of it in the Talmud, even things as significant as how to read Jewish laws and Jewish ideas, if they appear to only apply in the land of Israel, as arguably Shmita does, or some people think that it does. Does that mean that we shouldn't be observing it outside the land of Israel? Or should we just be observing it differently outside the land of Israel? Or maybe the same way in the land of Israel and outside of the land of Israel? There are many possibilities. And we also really want on this show to look at the concept of Shmita as an analogy, whether technically it applies or not. Our show started in March of 2016, so it isn't going to be until March that we enter our 7th year as a podcast. But it's also exciting and significant to understand that our 7th year as a podcast is going to start during the Shmita on the Jewish calendar. It's also an opportunity to even more intentionally fulfill our mission as a podcast of imagining what the future might look like and being even more explicit about that than we have in the past. Today, to kick off our exploration of the idea of Shmita, we have invited two people from something called the Shmita Project. The Shmita Project is housed within Hazon, which is an organization that's been around for now over 20 years. That's mission is to lead a transformative movement weaving sustainability into the fabric of Jewish life in order to create a healthier, more sustainable, and more equitable world for all. Hazon is known as an organization focused on environmental sustainability and justice, on nature, and on taking the experience of the outdoors and of nature as an important part of the Jewish spiritual experience. The Shmita Project is part of Hazon, and it's also a project that has many partners, including Judaism Unbound. On its website, the Shmita Project is described this way. The Shmita Project is working to expand awareness about the biblical sabbatical tradition. But we don't only want to raise awareness. We also want to explore the ways that traditional teachings about Shmita shed light on a significant range of contemporary issues that are directly or indirectly referenced in the concept of Shmita, including rest and work, relationship to land, relationship to community, relationship to debt and debt relief, definitions of community, and the issue of consumption itself. Our guests today, Knibb Henza and Zell Young, are leaders of the Shmita Project. Knibb Henza is the Director of National Programs at Hazon, where she manages programmatic content and outreach across the organization, including a variety of field building and climate-related initiatives. Zell Young is the Associate Director of National Programs at Hazon, and she is also an award-winning visual artist. We're so excited to jump into this topic of the Shmita for this series and for this year. So Knibb Henza, Zell Young, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
Yeah, really lovely to be joining you today. Thank you.
I wanted to start just by understanding what is your take, the Shmita Project's take on the Shmita and what it's all about, and how are you moving forward with that take into practical reality?
At Hazon, we talk a lot about the Jewish calendar, right? Like these cycles of time that we're so familiar with going through every year, right? Our holiday structure and the weekly cycles of work and rest. But one of the things we don't talk that often about is this bigger 7-year cycle, this gift that comes around every 7th year called the Shmita year, in which we really get to take a step back and assess bigger systems-wide questions around the way that these biblical concepts might have something to say for our life today. So traditionally, if you read the original source text, the original, Torah on what Shemitah is, it sounds an awful lot like, well, we were just talking about farmers, or, well, we're just talking about the way that we, treat our land or our harvests, or, it's a very place-based thing on the surface. But if you really look at the context there, if you really start to have conversation with about what is Shemitah, what is its relevance, what are the rabbis trying to say, and the commentary around this concept, you really start to understand that it's not just about agricultural rules and regulations. It's really about the way that we are living in relationship to land, to the natural world, to the cycles of the world that are around us, to one another, to debt, to the trappings of sort of modern life. And this is a thing that we really understand to be dynamic and fluid and constantly relevant to what we're doing. So with the Shemitah project, our main goal is really just to raise awareness of this particular cycle of time, what it has to say about what we're going through now, the conversations it could spark, the projects it could kickstart, the ways in which we can really just animate conversation and change the world through a lens of this teaching.
Shemitah really can be a whole societal reset. It's a whole host of economic adjustments to ensure the maintenance of a just and equitable society. And when we live in a society that struggles so much with injustice and issues of who has and who does not have, that Shemitah can just imagine a radical new way of living. That even though it's in the Bible, it's a really radical concept. Part of what we're doing is bringing this sort of concept that some would call esoteric and really show how radical and revolutionary it is.
Could you talk a little bit about how you got to this view of Shmita as the organization Hazon? Because I think about Hazon as focused on farming and outdoors kind of stuff. And, that's exactly the kind of organization that I worry that they're going to take on the Shmita, because then it's just going to get limited to this world of agriculture. But you've really blown it, like you're talking about, far, far outside of that. So I'm wondering what the process was for you as Hazon to investigate Shmita this way and to really see it as this much larger possibility than just focused on agriculture.
When Hazon was founded in 2000, we started with a cross-country bike ride from Washington State to Washington, D.C., with the sole purpose of raising awareness of environmental issues. And it was very clear that, as you said, Dan, we could have stayed in that bubble. But very, very quickly, early on in Hazon's journey, we realized that there was a lot more value in having the conversation of what is relevant about an agrarian tradition, right? If you look at the Torah, if you look at our history, we are a people of the land, right? We became a people of the book, but before that, we really were inextricably connected to the cycles of agriculture, of time, of the natural world. That is how we related to the temple, to one another, to practice. This was our life. And so if we look at, what is the wisdom that we see from that period of time that has informed, everything that we have become as a people, if we start to have the conversation of, what is relevant from those places in time, from those teachings, that even though we're not now the majority of us farmers, we're not beholden to the cycles of rain and dry spells and all of those things that were part of life 2,000 years ago, there's something very powerful to be said about that wisdom, still has relevance today. And so 2 Shmita cycles ago, so I guess 2007, we were a very young organization. We first started to have this conversation around, okay, what does Jewish time have to say about Shmita? Oh, interesting. So we had like 1 or 2 programs. It was like kind of a casual thing. In 2014, we really said, this should be on people's radar. This is a way of looking at the world. This is a radical approach to Jewish teachings and understanding that there is a lot of injustice in the world that goes beyond the environmental, right? Yes, this has a lot to teach us about climate change. Yes, this has a lot to teach us about, wise use of resources and space. This has a lot to teach us about, our interpersonal dynamics. So let's have a large conversation. It just so happened that at that time in 2014, there was also a large international climate conference happening that we were able to participate in. And there again, like connect the teachings of ancient Jewish tradition to something happening in modern life. And so when we came to this cycle, this is our 3rd Shmita cycle as an organization, we knew that we wanted to just carry forward all of that momentum from 7 years ago. And we really wanted it to make it an integral part of who we are as an organization and what our mission is right now, which is ultimately to turn the Jewish community outward so that we are looking beyond our own communities to say, how can Jewish tradition, how can what we know and have learned really influence a better, more positive, more just and sustainable world for everyone? And we think that Shmita is a really powerful tool to have that conversation.
So, okay, I'm curious about a few things. First off, I'm excited, Hannah, to hear you talk about the first one was in 2007 that Hazon did, because that means the 7th one will be 2049 to 50. And that's perfect for the Jubilee, which is every 49th, 50th year. Like literally on the secular calendar, we'll be able to look and see 49, 50. So if you're listening to this 30 years after, or 29 years after we release this, note that it's a Jubilee year, and I hope you're doing cool stuff for that. But anyway, back to Shmita Project. We like projects. We without doing this on purpose, we have connected with a lot of things called projects over the years. And I don't think that's an accident, because we spend a lot of time talking about how we need to be experimenting with Jewish tradition, playing around, sort of mobilizing the Jewish tradition as like a medium of art, as kind of a project, and not something that is sort of received in fully intact that we just sort of polish and preserve. We want to be doing the project. So we've connected with things like the Akedah Project, the Binding of Isaac Project, the Megillah Project related to the Purim story, and the Jewish Studio Project, a great organization in the Bay Area doing cool creative stuff, like all these projects. And I want to hone in not just on the word Shmita, but on the word project, because what excites me about what you're doing and your angle as the Shmita Project is that there's very much this sense that we're figuring it out. Yes, this is a very ancient tradition that we can point to biblical texts talking about. We can point to Talmudic texts saying, this is really important. Don't forget this. But there's this glorious energy when I enter spaces with you, with some of the other organizations you're working with, and even just with people when we start talking about the sabbatical year and what we might do with it. Because, nobody's story is, I grew up and this is the way I did Shmita, and it's really important to me to keep doing it that way. We have a lot of that with Rosh Hashanah or Passover or some other holidays. But with Shmita, nobody's really done it so much, especially outside of the land of Israel. So it's our privilege, our joy, our delight to be able to create it together, and in my view, our responsibility. So I'd love to hear from you about what that project word means for you.
Absolutely. And I think the Shmita Project website, it's shmitaproject.org. It's deliberately separate from the Hazon website because Hazon does not own Shmita. We don't want to claim to own Shmita. We want to convene a conversation or be part of a conversation of many different organizations and many different voices talking about Shmita. So right now, the Shmita Project is 52 organizations across the denominational spectrum who have their own voices and own opinions on Shmita. Recently, we had a Shmita Vision Summit where some of our partners got together. We realized that artists had a voice in this. And in Torah, there's black fire, which is the writing on the page. And there's also white fire, which is the space in between the letters. And we saw that as a space for artists to give wisdom about this tradition. And now we have 120 different artist submissions from around the world. We've recently partnered with the Shalom Hartman Institute in Israel, who are running their own Israeli Shmita prizes. There's a saying that there's 70 faces of Torah, and then we feel that artists can help illuminate some of those hidden faces.
I think that certain people who understand that there's art as part of this could say, oh, well, that's nice. They want to have art as part of, this thing. It's going to make nicer visuals, whatever it is. But that's not what this is about, as I understand it. Could you talk a little bit about why you think art is so important to this and I would imagine to any project that you might do on a Jewish topic? What is it that artists are doing that wouldn't be done if we didn't include artists in a serious way?
I think artists can show something that's not in the text that can create a whole different reality of thinking about something that you can't get through just reading a text. I think art is powerful, art is transformative, and artists' voices need to be valued in the same way as we would scientists, rabbis, thinkers. It would be stronger if we valued all the voices equally.
Admittedly, this is not for everyone, but we really believe in, Lex, as you said, co-creation of your Jewish experience, that there is so much within our tradition that can be taken literally, can be taken metaphorically, can be brought to life in new and interesting ways. And we really see the project part of this work to be that co-creation, to be that collaboration, that ability to really say, what is it about this concept that has meaning for me, for you, for this organization, for that group of people? And how can that all be shared under one umbrella of Jewish identity or Jewish practice? And art is such an incredible component of that creative process, right? There's so much to be said about bringing tradition to life, really breathing life into what we're experiencing, what we're doing. And art is just a fantastic way and every medium. And, within the project, we're showcasing written artists and visual artists and video and dance. And, there's all sorts of different ways of creating your own experience. But there is no Shmita tradition. You don't sit down around the Shmita Seder table and have a conversation about, what are your next 7 years going to look like? And what did you learn from the last 7 years? Maybe we should.
There isn't yet. Yeah, I was just going to say, there isn't one of those yet. Sounds like a project.
Exactly. And so we actually received a submission for the Shmita prizes recently from Eli Kaplan Wildman, who, actually is saying, what if we have the conversation at the start of the Rosh Hashanah year when we sit down to this table to have, our meal to start the year? What if we're actually saying, what did the last 7 years look like? And what are the next 7 years going to look like? Can we ritualize this process? So part of, co-creating our Jewish experience is also thinking about ritual and process. And what does, our history inform about how we want to experience life today as a Jew, as a citizen of the world, as somebody who is in conversation about what could, should, or, can be done about what's going on around us.
That's really powerful. I really, first off, we're going to have a conversation with Eli Kaplan Wildman, who you mentioned. So listeners, get psyched. There's going to be even more on this front. But in that Vision Summit that you mentioned, I had the privilege of going and proudly repping Judaism Unbound. Something crystallized for me where I thought through in my head, every Jewish holiday, Jewish ritual that sort of has a broad following that isn't just sort of for insiders. And pretty much every single one I can think of has what I would term a soundtrack. It has melodies, it has music that people, even Jews who aren't going to synagogue every week, they know. My dad has the license plate Dayenu on his car, which is a song. It's not just a song. It's liturgy from the Passover Seder. But people People recognize Dayenu even if they're not setting foot in synagogue very much a lot of the time. People recognize, I think part of why the Havdalah service has sort of skyrocketed in observance the last number of decades is that Debbie Friedman wrote a melody that people loved. And so an observance that not that many people were doing for a bunch of reasons besides this, but that a bunch of people weren't doing became more popular because we had this riveting soundtrack for it. And so I'm really invested in this art side. Like, how do we take what is going to be submitted or what has already been submitted to the Shmita prizes, and how do we sort of start fashioning the scaffolding for this ritual so that we're thinking like, oh, we need this to be sticky. We need this to be something that in 100 years, kids don't not grow up with Shmita. Like for me, I didn't grow up knowing what Shmita was. I did know what other Jewish holidays and Jewish observances were, right? Like we need urgently to make this cross people's minds as one of the central Jewish rituals there is. And so I'm curious, like, is that part of what's behind the art? Is the idea that like some of these will help sort of with I know stickiness is kind of like a crude word. I'm using that not to trivialize, but like to make this ritual sticky is the art sort of meant to long term create sort of a ritualized liturgy of what Shmita even is? Because I'm actually really intrigued by what you said, Hannah, that like we haven't had the Seder. My takeaway isn't, oh, we have other things. Like my takeaway is we need something like that.
That is exactly why I want to give credit where credit is due. So the Shmita prizes, which are a component of the Shmita project, the Shmita prizes, which is this art competition we're kind of talking about, they started from an idea that came from Rabbi Nina Beth Cardin and Rabbi Jeremy Benstein in the United States and in Israel, kind of coming together and saying, like, how do we create meaning? How do we create ritual out of this concept that has so much to teach us? And out of that, was born this project. And so from its very beginning, it has been thinking about these exact questions, right? Like, how do we almost popularize? How do we brand? How do we think about getting this message out to the most people that we possibly can? And so while we haven't quite, cracked it just yet, I think that there is, there's very much intention behind monetizing the prizes and saying, like, this is something we're really investing in. This is something that we very much want people to actively participate in and co-create this space. At the end of the prizes, there will be an independent panel of folks who are kind of thinking about, what are the things that not only are the best, but that actually have the most potential to change the way that people relate to this concept. What is there a song that comes in that is catchy that we can share with people to have a melody, to have a soundtrack? Is there a ritual practice that might make sense, to try to get into people's homes as they think about, bringing this to life? There's a lot that we don't know about how this is going to unfold. But there's a lot of intention there behind just expanding the conversation. We're very pleased to say that at this point, it's really become a global conversation. And where that's going to take us, we don't know yet, but it's very exciting to think about.
I mean, this whole process that you're describing, it makes me think about what would the world look like if we had something like this for every Jewish ritual, because like we're sorely in need of artists and other people to sort of play around with every Jewish ritual so that's one thing for other people that are listening and want to have other projects. The other thing just to note is that as you're talking about this, what's coming into my mind is the whole idea of the brood 10 cicadas, that they come every 17 years or whatever it is. And, and I remember when I was thinking about it, I was like, but don't we have cicadas every year? Like, what is this whole thing about this one that comes and it's like, it turns out we do have cicadas every year, but there's one particular big brood of cicadas only comes every, is it 17 years? Whatever that is. And the cyclical nature of the Jewish calendar that you were talking about earlier, that you could think about the function of Jewish holidays as kind of revving up a certain engine, and it kind of has to get you to like leap over to a certain amount of time. So for Shabbat, we can only we have to do it every week because the pressures of life are so intense that you can't even remember to rest if it was just once a month or once a year. It wouldn't be enough to really have the impact that you need to have. So we have to ritually rest every week in order to really get that to be part of our lives. Whereas if you think about something like atonement on this theory, you would say, well, that's enough to have that once a year. And we can do like a really intense atonement. And then that gets us like revved up and we can leap over the whole year till we get to the next Yom Kippur. With Shmita, I'm thinking about two elements here. One is that it comes every 7 years. So again, back to the theory, there's something about it that it's so powerful that it can push you over 6 years till the next, and the other is that it's a whole year. It may potentially be powerful enough to change the world for the next 6 years, but only if you spend an entire year doing it as opposed to a day like on Shabbat or Yom Kippur. So I'm wondering, just in terms of that kind of potential function of Shmita on the Jewish calendar, if you could talk some about whether it's in the realm of agriculture and outdoorsy kind of things, which I don't, which I think climate change, for example, is a very serious version of that I shouldn't call it an outdoorsy thing, like that's about the survival of the earth. And then also things that don't have to do with the environment, like you were talking about debt relief earlier and other kinds of things. And I'm just wondering how you think about the cyclicality of paying attention to this on the calendar and also the potential that a year-long, quote, observance could be different from what we're used to with a day-long observance or a week-long observance.
I think part of what we want to do with Shemitah is that we also want to think about it on the other 6 years. So what does the cycle of 7 years mean? It's not just the one Shemitah year that might be holy. It's the other 6 years that might lead up to it, which are, what can we do with that cycle? Shemitah literally means release, which I think is such an interesting word because we're talking about, I think about release, I think about letting go. But we're talking about all these ways to ritualize and add to it and add to our practice. But how do we still keep the core value of letting go and releasing?
I love what you said, Dan, about the sort of build up to kind of carry you forward. And it's very true. I mean, in the same way that you prepare for Shabbat, right? We need that once a week. You can do that for most people in a couple of hours, right? Like you can Friday afternoon, you can kind of come home and a couple hours, you're like ready to go. Your home is prepared, you're clean, you've made bread, you're like ready to set the table, light the candles, we're good. But for Shmita, you have to carry through an entire year. So if you think about that practically, you can't harvest food. You can harvest, but you can't sow, you can't plant, you can't do the work of actually, subsisting for an entire year. So, if we take that literally, then, how long does it take you to store up enough food, enough resources in order to last through the entire year? If you take that metaphorically, well, then, we've been talking about this sort of radical nature of what the Shemitah year means, right? It means release. It means reset. It means to think about the world from a different perspective for an entire year. Well, if you're really going to do that, you can't just wake up on Rosh Hashanah and go, great, Shemitah year's here, I'm ready to go. You have to prepare. You have to think about what is the intention? How is it going to get me through fall and winter and spring and summer? And what are each of those seasons going to bring for me? And what are each of those moments in time going to have, implications in my broader community? How is this reflected in my life? And what do I need to do? What does my community need to do in order to prepare? And so for some people, if the intention is, okay, we're not going to be takers in this year, right? We're going to be letting things rest. We're not going to be takers. Okay, well, then you might want to think about installing your community solar system, that's going to take 3 years to get off the ground. You got to prepare for that. If you don't want to be harvesting, well, then you're going to plant fruit trees, but you have to have it in time to, have that harvest. So there's so many dimensions, so much layering to this work. We could really talk about it for the next 6 years.
That's both a crisis and an opportunity. I mean, I think that, because I was thinking earlier that I wanted to tell our listeners, hey, don't worry about it if you are only hearing this now and the Shemitah's coming up. Like, you actually have a whole year to do stuff. So even if it takes you till December to figure out how you want to do something significant for the Shemitah, you'll still have like 9 or 10 months to do. So that's really exciting, because a lot of times when we talk about some Jewish holiday coming up, it's like, if you didn't listen to Judaism Unbound, and you were a couple weeks behind, then you listen to it and it's over and whatever, I'll try to remember to do something next year. So on the one hand, there's this opportunity to do something for the whole year, and you could sort of figure it out in a few months from now. But the other, and it's even the opportunity part about the other that I want to think about, and Lex, maybe this was part of your secret plan the whole time, because you want to be doing Shemitah episodes all year long, that by the end of this year, this Jewish year, like, we really want to be launching people off to the next 6 years to be basically planning for the next Shemitah of 2028 or whatever. So that's, I don't know, Lex, is that your secret plan?
Yes, that is the plan. The I don't know, the curtain has been, whatever, reveal metaphors, that we have broken the fourth wall. Yeah, that's the plan. But yeah, for me, that's a core takeaway I have for the future is, like, I've been prepping for the Shemitah year, but I haven't really been prepping for like the next cycle of the 7 years afterwards. And I think that's as much of an important piece as the year itself, because this isn't just, abstract. What if literally every synagogue, every JCC, every federation, every Jewish anything, or, by the way, forget institutions, if just every family or group of people or giving circle spent 6 years putting money or resources aside, and then we actually had the tools in the 7th year to really make a huge difference, not to contribute to like Jewish causes necessarily, but to contribute to the world in that 7th year through our dollars. Like, that would be so powerful. And it reminds me, funny enough, of another biblical moment where, like, the rise to power of Joseph in Egypt is because he could tell, or he got a vision that there was going to be this terrible famine in Egypt. And he was like, yo, we're going to prep. And then because he did that, and then there was a famine, he was proven right. Like, he was able to rise into this position of power, and like the rest of the entire story goes from there. And that wasn't that Joseph, got some vision from God and then helped the Israelites. It was that he helped the Egyptians become safe from this famine. Like, what a powerful message that is. If we were to say, like, oh, as Jewish communities, we should be prepping when it's not Shemitah, when it's not our year of release, to be ready to assist the rest of the world. So that was more a thought than a question. But to either of you, what might we gain from that notion of the full 7-year cycle? You could conceptualize the Shemitah as actually the beginning of the next cycle. Maybe that's too overwhelming. But how should we be orienting to the broader notion of 7 years and not just this one?
Yeah, I think absolutely that Jewish organizations and institutions need to be having that conversation of collectively, how can we create these systems of organizational change? At the Visions Summit yesterday, an idea that got floated was a Shemitah Bail Relief Fund. And that was from someone who was not from the United States, who couldn't believe how our bail system worked. Or we're partners with where one of our Shmita project partners, Zell, is doing a Shemitah loan forgiveness fund. With the rising issue of student debt in this country, what does it look like as we have a Jewish community take on student debt or any kind of debt, credit card debt? What would that look like if we made that a priority of the Jewish community?
And then there's something to be said about this moment we're in as far as, our changing climate, right? What if, Lex, you had mentioned it's, you haven't prepared for the next 6. I would argue that that's what the 7th year is for, right? It's both to rest, but it's also to reset and to start to set those intentions for the next 6. And so what if we used that 7th year for planning? What if we said, this is the year where we're really going to assess the situation, and we're going to come up with a plan that we're going to then spend the next 6 years enacting. And you can do that in your personal life, or you can do that in your organizational life. And to the point of, I haven't prepared and it's right around the corner. we get back to that sort of co-creating our experience, right? So, if it's important to someone to stock up their food pantry for the entire year so that they're not purchasing food, well, okay, you might have wanted to start a few months ago. If it's important to you instead to say, how am I allocating my resources? And, one of the things that was shared in staff meeting, we talk about this a lot at Hazon, was, okay, well, maybe I'm going to take the money that I was spending on these certain items that are extra for me, and I'm going to donate that, or I'm going to use that money in a different way this year. Well, that doesn't require a whole lot of preparation, but organizationally, right? One of the things we're really looking at across many of our programs is planning for, in 7 years, our climate is going to look very different, right? We are on a rapid train to multiple degrees of warming that is really going to start to affect, and it is already affecting our quality of life. So what if every Jewish institution took this year to create a climate justice plan or a social justice plan or some sort of, sustainability plan broadly defined that they then enacted over the next 6 years? How much less of an impact could we be having on our carbon footprint? How much more of an impact could we be having on our social systems? Is this the year that organizations who have previously been silent on advocacy efforts step up and say, we support a comprehensive climate bill? Is this the year that organizations who have previously been silent on issues of debt or, societal injustice step up and say, this is something we care about because Judaism has a moral imperative to respond to the world's crises? And to your point about, Joseph and the Egyptians, it's not just us. We've become this very insulated community. We've sort of isolated ourselves in a way that's been about self-preservation. And that has worked really, really well for us. But we also have this teaching. We have this sort of force within Jewish tradition that says it's not just about us. It's about the entire world. It's about our obligation to be the stewards of goodness in this world. And, how can we use these cycles? How can we use these gifts in order to actually enact that mission?
Hannah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about a concept, in this case from the Bible, that some will look at very narrowly. Right. So the most narrow way to look at Shmita is to say it only applies in the land of Israel and it's only about agriculture. And it's about law, and that law doesn't apply in the diaspora. And so, diaspora Jews, you're off the hook. Right. Another way to look at it is to say it only, on a legal standpoint, it only applies in the land of Israel, but it's a really great set of ideas. So let's do it outside of Israel as well. And, I think about the Leash Tag Ranch, for example, that has that is in California, but they do their agriculture during the Shmita year the way that you would do it in Israel, technically. But then there's the even more, let's say, radical approach. But it's on the one hand radical, but on the other hand, it's like the opposite of radical in the sense that to me, it gets at the original understanding of what this is really about. And you say, like, in a world in which basically everybody is a farmer, to have a practice that says you have to stop farming for a year feels to me like in a world where everybody is a lawyer, you would say you got to stop practicing law for a year. And so it feels to me like a more serious understanding of Shmita conceptually would be one, along the lines of what you've been talking about, that says, let's actually take this as a much, much larger imperative. And that's not some modern Jews coming up with some radical notion. That's actually a pretty straightforward understanding of what the ancient Israelites, the ancient Hebrews were trying to get at here. In a world where everybody was a farmer, they said, let's rest for a year from farming. And in a world where everybody's all kinds of different things today, what would that look like? And, I'm just sort of thinking in terms of, like, again, maybe this is not so relevant for this year's Shmita because, like, we haven't planned, but I'm thinking a little bit of even about the 2028 Shmita and saying maybe for the next 6 years, like, all of us in every profession, including and maybe especially the Jewish nonprofit world, should be, like you were talking about earlier, like putting a seventh of our money away every year or a sixth or whatever that, not a math guy. But I mean, I'm curious about like whether there's something that you're already doing or that maybe we or others should be doing that goes beyond the artists competition. Like I would love to have a competition for people who just have great ideas about what to do, that are just, you would write an essay or something like that. And then just sort of more conceptually, I'm interested if you could talk some about whether this approach that you're taking to Shmita actually is piloting in a way, or maybe building on an approach to understanding the deep possibility of ancient Jewish ideas that people tend to read narrowly, and that limits our sense of what Judaism is in a fundamental way.
I actually want to start with something that you kind of hinted at originally, which is to say that, if you observed this in the most strict way, it would be one way. And if you observed this in a metaphorical way, it would be another way. And if you observed this in sort of a spiritual way, it would be like entirely different. And one of the things that I love about Jewish tradition, going back really from the beginning of time, is that there has always been a spectrum. There's always been a spectrum of observance of the ways in which people came to tradition, to teachings, to law, to, observance. And that's always been part of our history. The thing about Shmita is we know from the sources, we know from rabbinic commentary, from the history books, outside of the Torah, that it was messy. This was not something that was really straightforward. There are all sorts of implications around every 6 years, all of a sudden, okay, well, your debt is released. Well, okay, what happens then to the person who gave the loan? Like, did they then become impoverished? Like, if they're off the, they're all of a sudden out all sorts of money. What happens when, if you didn't prepare, if for 2 years out of that 6-year cycle, you didn't get enough grain to last for the 7th year, the actual implications of practicing this are messy at best and, catastrophic at worst. So I think just starting from that perspective of like, there's an entire spectrum we have to understand of observance and the way that people come to all of Jewish practice. I think it's really important to point that out, that this is not necessarily, all sunshine and rainbows. That being said, yes, I think we take that perspective that there is so much value in understanding and breaking down the complexity of these structures, of this history, of the ways it worked and it didn't work, of the ways that we can both literally and metaphorically and spiritually, explore all of the dynamic aspects to every part of Jewish tradition. And truthfully, like we have similar conversations around other moments in the calendar, but Shmita just happens to be a very all-encompassing year-long practice that you can really sink your teeth into and really start to explore. I mean, even if you just use that as like your entry point into navigating the world of Jewish history, modern practice, and rabbinic commentary, like you could spend your whole life there. There is something very powerful about saying, we were a people of the land. We are a people of the land, even if it doesn't always feel that way. And so what are the things that we can, could, or should be learning and adopting in today's society from that tradition that really have the power to make change?
I am really aligned with the question Dan asked and Hannah, your approach to it around the narrow read of Shmita as referring to a specific land and to a specific sort of narrow understanding of topics versus understanding it broader. And I want to do something that maybe will strike people as strange. I guess listeners of our show, it won't strike you as that strange, but like, I want to sort of rebuke our ancestors a little bit. Which I'm not saying because I think they're the worst. I want to say something that feels like it's not always said, which is we kind of messed this up, in my view, Shmita. Like, there were a bunch of biblical observances that you could read in their biblical context and say, that's an Israel thing. That's something that happened specifically in Israel. And there were actually a ton of those, not just Shmita. The pilgrimage festivals, Sukkot, Passover, Shavuot, those are holidays that in the Bible, you went to Jerusalem and there were a bunch of sacrifices at a specific temple, and that was how they happened. The rabbis made the correct call once that temple was destroyed and once there was a diaspora around the world to say, oh, it's not actually just in Israel. We're going to do Sukkot, we're going to do Passover, we're going to do Shavuot all around the world. And that was actually a choice. I think it was the correct choice. But it was a choice. They could have said, oh, I guess we can't do the sacrifice. There's a bunch of sacrifices that are mentioned for those holidays that only could happen at a specific place. And they could have said, oh, I guess we can't do those. So these holidays are done. Or we sort of observe them as mourning days instead of celebrations because we can't do them the old way. But they said, we're going to do it. With Shmita, they went a different direction. They said, oh, it's only Israel. And we can look retrospectively and we can pretend that there's a deep logic where the text sort of informs us that it must be that way. But I really do think that both of those choices on the festivals front and on the Shmita front were choices. And I'm saying this not to shake my finger and say, oh my gosh, our ancestors are the worst. My point is that I want us to really name that a lot of what we're doing is in fact new. It is in fact a new thing in 2021, or at least in 2007 through 2021, to take a look at Shmita in diaspora in this expansive sense and start to think through what it will mean. But I think what opens up when we say, wow, we are the pioneers of a new practice, a new diasporic sabbatical year that is gonna take into account our approach to politics and our advocacy as a collective. It's going to take into account what our institutions do on a local level. It's going to take into account our own personal lives and how we, like Dan said, if you're a lawyer, maybe you take a year off from lawyering. I have 2 lawyer parents. That'd be interesting. That really feels important to say. And it's not that we then discard all the ways in which, of course, Shmita is also an ancient ritual. But I'm curious, would you push back on me in the ways that I kind of want to name all this newness? Do you really see this as a continuation, or would you actually agree with me that this is new?
I think I want to agree and push back. I think that, yes, this is new in a lot of ways. I think I want to push back on it was a choice. Well, it definitely was a choice, but I think that it was a very intentional choice, right? Shmita in Israel, as I said, it was messy. There was a lot that societally people hadn't quite figured out. And so every 6 years, it wasn't that it was a surprise, but it was kind of a surprise. And it came around and it caused all sorts of disturbances. And it wasn't necessarily always, this thing that really equalized society in the way that we hoped that it would. And so in some ways, if I had to guess, going back and reading the commentary that I have, there was very much a decision made that this was something that we would sort of let fall by the wayside for a while. I think in the last 20 or 30 years, arguably going back to the 60s was sort of the revitalization of the earth-based Jewish practice movement. We've started to see a resurgence of energy looking at the land-based practices of Jewish tradition. And that in and of itself, the revival of all of these traditions in North America, in a land that is not Israel, in a space that is really only has the capacity to look at this from a metaphorical lens, that has been new. And that has been a complete transformation of the way that we interpret Jewish tradition and the way that we bring it to life and in practice today. And there is a good segment of the Jewish population who would say, incorrect. This is not how we practice Shmita. This is not how we practice Jewish tradition. We are not in the land of Israel. We are not in a place where we can be deciding, where we should be co-creating, where we should be the deciders of, what tradition is or isn't. To a lot of your points, yes, this is new and exciting and wonderful. And for some people, this might be new and terrifying and awful, right? There has to be the understanding that we all come to this from different places.
The reintroduction or revitalization goes back to when Rev Kook made his aliyah to Israel and had to deal with this issue with farmers in the land of Israel. And that was over 100 years ago. And that might have been the first historical resurgence of Shmita in sort of the modern times. We talk about the prepping, these people who made the journey to Israel, were practicing farming in Eastern Europe to prepare to farm in Israel. They didn't just go, they had to learn how to farm, and they made practice farms in Europe.
Before we close, I wanted to just really make the connection to something that you've talked about and that I personally think is really critical for so many reasons, and that's climate change. And the way that I'm thinking about it is I've often thought about Judaism this way, that there's a kind of what I call the Spider-Man principle involved, which is that with great power comes great responsibility. That's what Peter Parker's Uncle Ben said to him. And, he took that to heart as Spider-Man. But I think that it actually fits a case like this really, really clearly, because I think at least one way, again, this is another way to interpret like the halakha, the Jewish path, is to say like, okay, in a world in which people were small-time farmers, basically, and the only part of the world that they could really affect in a substantial way is their own little plot of land. And you say, okay, well, how are you going to make that little plot of land most maximally healthy? You say, okay, well, we're going to let it rest for a year every 7 years, et cetera, et cetera. But it feels like the condition of humanity today is that we human beings as individuals and as a collective have an impact on the entire planet. And it just feels like a straightforward understanding of Shmita to me that says that in that world where we actually can harm the entire planet in the way that 2,000, 3,000 years ago we used to be able to harm a little plot of land, that the most basic understanding of Shmita becomes that it has to be a practice that's the question of how we're caring for the planet as a whole. And that to me is like potentially an extremely radical and important contribution that the Jews could make to the world at large, to say that we would like to introduce a worldwide practice of every seventh year having that be a planning year, that maybe, our treaties or the Paris Accord, whatever, is always like, okay, we're going to reassess this every 7 years, and that kind of thing. And it feels to me like that kind of approach in some way has great power, and that potentially if we were looking at Judaism in a more traditional way, we would be overly limiting ourselves by looking at it in a small way rather than in the larger way that it both is open to and that we need.
I absolutely love that image and that understanding of that sort of changing the center of focus from that small plot of land that we have direct control over because we are, one-on-one in relationship with it, to this globalized world that we now find ourselves in, where our decisions really do have implications across the world. The thing that comes to my mind immediately is like, when's the best time to plant a tree? 10 years ago? When's the best time to plant a tree is today? And that's sort of where we're at with this work, right? Like, we should have acted many years ago. We didn't. But the beauty of the Jewish calendar is that it offers us these moments of reflection. It offers us these opportunities to really radically change our behaviors and to say, I am going to take the opportunity to do something different. And Shmita is one of those beautiful gifts. I think to your point of, is this something we can teach the rest of the world? It so happened that 7 years ago, much of this work that we were doing sort of aligned with the international conversations on climate at the time. It's happening again. And so we're actually part of an international interfaith coalition of folks who are creating what are called faith long-term plans. And these are climate plans. These are climate action plans representing faith groups from around the world in every faith tradition you could possibly imagine, and then some, who are saying, over the next 5 to 10 years, so 7 years, this is how we are going to take a stand on climate change. This is how we are going to change the way that we tend our land. Are we planting grass or are we planting trees? This is how we're going to invest our finances. This is how we are going to think about the ways that our buildings are maintained, our infrastructure. This is how we're going to approach education through theology, because there's not a religion on this planet that doesn't have some central focus of connection with the earth. There is this relationship that we have and this responsibility to care for the world around us. And that is universal. So I love this idea that, Jewish tradition has something to teach the world, because there is so much richness there. And yes, I absolutely believe that this practice has the ability to to change the world for the better.
Yeah. So we're reaching the end of our time, but it's not really the end because this is the first of many, many, many wonderful conversations about Shmita that we're going to be releasing. Oh, wow. Shmita that we're going to be releasing in the next few weeks and then throughout the whole Shmita year, because we don't want to just get lost in the energy for the first little bit and then forget. So there's going to be many episodes throughout the entirety of the year. But as we close out, the last thing that I would just ask to you is for folks who are really excited, energized, rejuvenated, all of those things, how do they learn more? Where do they go? Help us out.
Yeah, so you can always learn more at shmitaproject.org. And that's Googleable and, all the good things there. So shmitaproject.org will give you everything you need to know about what is Shmita, how do you think about engaging with it. There's all sorts of submissions from artists all over the world, as well as resources that we've compiled over the last many years to help you navigate that space. And then the other thing I would say, just on a practical front, is, if we think about the relationship between what was land to Israelites, 2,000 years ago, what is your land today? Is it, your home? Is it the way that you consume food? Is it the way that you, are a consumer and spender in the world at large? Like, what is your thing that you really want to focus on? So, like, for instance, we've got folks at Hazon who have said, well, there's a little free food pantry down the street from me. And so, every week for the Shmita year, I'm going to go donate food to the food pantry because that's something that I can do as like a way to give out. We've also got folks who have said, I'm not going to consume things. I'm not going to purchase things that I don't need throughout this year. And I'm instead going to use that money to do other things good with it. Whether it's, helping somebody release themselves from debt, or whether it's giving to a cause that they believe in, whatever it may be. So there's lots of different practical ways that you can sort of implement this in your own life, but you can also learn more online.
Thank you both so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We want to remind you, definitely check out the Shmita Project website. It is so full of amazing resources. You can check it out at shmitaproject.org. That's SHMITA project.org. And you can check out the Shmita prizes and see the amazing art submissions that people have sent. You can even submit your own submissions. There's a bunch of categories, written work and musical work and visual art, all sorts of stuff. So check it out, and also go there just to learn more about Shmita and what the Shmita Project is doing to create new forms of Shmita. So we are thrilled to be one of the partner organizations and thrilled to really encourage you to check out that site. So stay tuned for our remaining episodes leading up to when the sabbatical year begins on Rosh Hashanah. The next few weeks are going to be awesome. And then a reminder that we'll have reminder episodes that look at Shmita from other lenses once a month or so, more or less, for the rest of the calendar year from Rosh Hashanah till next Rosh Hashanah. So we hope that you'll check those out. And we also, as always, hope that you'll be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook or Instagram or Twitter pages. Those are all Judaism Unbound for our handles. You can head to our website, judaismunbound.com. You can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. And we, of course, really deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you're able to send our way, which you can do via judaismunbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.